So let's take a look at the advanced section. And so this is iOS as a front end, basically going through what the API, what APIs are. I think I went through that in the beginning with the kind of HTTP request response cycle on the board, right? Basically, it's just the front and the back end don't have to know each other. They just have to know.
Just here to get some supplies.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. You're in the video.
Oh, my bad.
It's all good. So it's the same thing as you've done with the web development stacks, right? So you have a back end that is built on whatever technology. The front end is just making requests and expecting back some data, right? So today we're going to use the Star Wars API backend, right? It's an API, meaning that it has various routes that we can make requests to, and depending on how they documented it, we can make requests for people or, like movies or vehicles and so on and so forth, right? But this is Star Wars one is a really good one to start when you're learning it because it doesn't require you to have any kind of like key. It's just free for all. That means you can totally DDoS it if you wanted to. But so far, I think nobody has wanted to do that. So they're just not restricting people. And you can just make that request wherever you are, right? So normally when you make an API request to things that are, that are maintained well, they require you to register with them and have a key for each user. That way, when you make the request, you send the key in the header, and they look at the key, and they have automated systems where if one person or one key is repeatedly making these calls, then they're going to cut that guy off so that you cannot DDoS me, right? If you exceed X amount of calls per minute, they're going to just, block you. So that's kind of like a measure to help. And also a lot of things, they track how many times you've called it to charge you money, right? If you exceed X amount, they charge you some money. But basically using the vanilla version that we're going to use, you don't need any kind of frameworks at all. You just do it without importing anything, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to make this very simple project here, and we're going to make a call to Star Wars API. And we're supposed to get back some JSON looking like this, okay? Now, if it's your first time doing it, you're going to have to change this arbitrary loads, and I'm going to do that later on when I get into the project, okay? And really, it's super easy. So let's get into it, right? I'm going to open up OneNote. I did write down some notes for this, but I don't think we're going to be using that until later on. Yeah, so Alamo Fire part and then the Alamo Fire stuff I wrote down in notes, but right now it's just the basic API demo. Let's go ahead and create some new project here. We're going to make it a single page application, API demo. Not going to use core data. Next, create. Okay, so we got this guy on the left, on the right, and we got our code here on this side. Okay. So let's see what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and just go in this view controller, and in the view did load, just for demonstration purposes, we're just going to write our code in here. So when the view loads, it's going to run that code in there, right? So what we want to do is just what it says here on the platform, right? We're going to have to make a URL first, okay? So let URL equals to URL. This is the type of URL in Swift, right? And we're going to make it this. And this is the Star Wars API. Okay, so that's the first thing you're going to need. So now that we have this URL variable created, we're going to create the URL session to handle the request tasks. And I'm just going to copy this because otherwise I would just have to type it in anyways. So create the URL session to handle the request. The first step is to specify the URL, which we do here. And then we're going to create a data task to make the request and run the completion handler, which is this part here. Right? So this is a function, or it's not a function, it's a task that we're going to run, and it's taking in this URL that we made up here, right? And this is Swift's native way of running, like making that URL request, right? So in the completion handler, we're going to get data, response, and error, right? And here, this is kind of like a good little, a little syntactic sugar thing where if you want to print some data, you don't know if it's nil or not. If it's nil, if you print it, sometimes it'll crash, right? If it's an optional, you try to unwrap. So if you do the 2 question marks and you give it a string afterwards, if that is nil, it'll just print no data and it won't crash your app. Okay? So we do that, and then we execute the task and wait for the response, which is right here. Okay? So in the platform, they kind of go through what each of these steps actually mean, right? They give you a little bit more detail, and you can read that later on. So basically, this is pretty much, let's run this and see if we get that data back. Okay. Let's run that. Whoa, it's huge. There we go. So we're running it. Nothing's going to show up on the screen, but we do see that, look at that, app transport security has blocked a clear text HTTP resource load since it is insecure, right? And that means that we skipped this info plist stuff, right? And I do have it here in the notes. Enable HTTP transport if not already enabled. And what you do is, if you get this error here and it says that it's blocking a request because it's insecure, you want to go to your info.plist, right here. In this file here, you want to click on add. In the add, you want to type in app transport, right? That's the second one right here. In the transport security settings, there's a drop down, but also you want to click the plus button, right? And we're going to allow arbitrary loads. So enter. And then over here in the value, we're going to change this no to yes, like that. So once that's done, Command B to build it. And we're going to stop it, and we're going to run it again and see if we get the API stuff here. Okay, so it looks like we got the error that's not there anymore, right? The error's not there anymore, but it didn't print out our data. That's because we didn't actually print the data, right? Or it's, let's see. Let's go over here. Okay. Transport security settings, print data, response, error. Okay, let's see what's, yeah. So we need to, so on the second panel here, JSON data in Swift, we're going to do the same thing, but we're not going to print out this stuff, right? Comment that out. We are going to print out, we're still going to need this though. We're still going to need this. So data error response in, but we're going to do this one. Do catch. Okay. So we're going to use the data, and we're going to try to JSON serialize it to make it a JSON object. Right? Because we printed it before, it just showed us, however many bytes. That's not what we need. We need to have it as JSON format so we can use it, right? So we're going to run this block of code, we're going to create an if let JSON result equals to try JSON serialization.json object with this data that we got back from the response. And we're going to print the JSON result if that does happen. And if it doesn't happen, we're going to print the error. Right? So if we run this now, we should see the JSON of the Star Wars people. Yeah, there we go. So we serialized the JSON, and now when we printed the JSON result, we got all of this stuff, right? And we can dig in here and get the data that we need. I would say the main kind of like area of difficulty with the HTTP requests in iOS is getting the data into the format that you want so you can use it, right? So different APIs will send you back different formatted data. Generally, it'll be some type of JSON, but because iOS is strongly typed, you have to kind of force cast each of the things into the kind of type that you want. Otherwise, you can't really use it, right? That is usually like a meticulous process of picking things apart, looking at the documentation, what they give you, logging it, seeing what you can access, and then taking that out and putting it into like a class or something that you have created, right? And you guys can learn more about that in this chapter over here, how to deal with JSON in Swift. And it's not very long. It's just pretty short reading, but it's I'm going to leave that to you guys to do on your own. Okay. So basically, using just this bit of code here, we've created a request to Star Wars API. We got back this data, right? You're going to use this data in one of the assignments to create a Star Wars kind of encyclopedia. So basically what it is you're taking the names and putting it in a table view, right? It's pretty straightforward, right? But this is still the basic way to do it, right? Just using nothing else but Swift. It's similar to how using vanilla JavaScript to make HTTP requests. You can do it, but it's not very efficient. It doesn't look good. Right? It's not as robust. So that's why we have like frameworks like jQuery or Angular that has those things built in that can help us make it easier. Right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to make another project, and we're going to use Alamofire. And you'll see how much simpler it is. Okay? Alamofire is a really popular framework. A lot of companies use it. There's very good documentation. It's very robust. There's a ton of different functions that you can run in Alamofire to do different things, like images, for example. Okay, so let's close this guy. We're going to close this, and we're going to use our notes over here. Right? And I will send you guys these notes later on in the Slack. But these are the steps that you want to follow to install CocoaPods and get the Alamofire up and running. Right? And they've changed this, and this changes from time to time. Like I built this out yesterday morning, and it was different than the one I did even in December. So Alamofire will change. The kind of the pros and cons of using these external frameworks is that yes, it makes things a lot easier, but you're kind of at the mercy of them if they change things. Right? So it's not really within your control. Like it's like Angular. Angular, like a lot of companies will use Angular, but they won't use the built-in directives that we've been using, like ng-hide, ng-repeat. Those are just built-in directives that Angular has made. So companies will build an ng-repeat exactly the same way as Angular built it, but they'll build it like my company repeat, so that when Angular changes their ng-repeat, the my company repeat does not change, so it doesn't break the code. Right? So just a heads up on that. Alamofire does change quite a bit. It's a good thing and a bad thing, right? You want them to maintain the code and adapt to new versions of Swift, but also just keep in mind it'll break your thing once it comes out with that new version.
Is that a best practice in general?
I mean, I think in the iOS world, it's really unavoidable because just given the fact that Apple just updates Swift so often, and they update their OS and update Xcode so often, it's just one more thing to fix during this period of where you're fixing everything. So, it really is a pros and cons, really. If you're running a large company with a lot of users, then maybe you want to build something in-house rather than use Alamofire. But for the most part, it's fine. You just have to like be really alert and be like proactive with the changes and get ahead of that before it releases. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a new project here. I'm gonna name this guy AF Alamo Fire demo. Okay. Okay, so you see that the folder is right here. Okay, I'm gonna close this guy, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna install CocoaPods on it, right? So if I click open the project, you'll see that there's a folder here and also the project file, right? We click on that, it'll open the project in Xcode. Now, what we want to do for you guys, if you do not have CocoaPods installed on your computer, right? You want to open up the terminal. Like, let's just open it up in this folder right here, and we want to get CocoaPods installed. So the code to do that is sudo gem install CocoaPods, right? You guys will type that in. It'll run this stuff and it'll install. Maybe it'll ask you for a password. Right? I already installed CocoaPods, so I'm not going to do it on this step. We're just going to initialize the pod file, right? So for you guys, when you do it later on, you want to do sudo gem install CocoaPods. It'll run a bunch of stuff. It might take a couple minutes, and then it'll bring you back to this screen showing this line here. Okay. So once you're back in this line, inside of this folder of the project, you want to type pod init. If you do not have CocoaPods, it'll tell you pod is an unknown name. It doesn't know what to do. If that's the case, you got to install CocoaPods. Okay. So pod init, it'll create this pod file for you. So right now we have this pod file that's generated for us. We want to go ahead and open this with an editor. I'm just gonna choose. I'm just gonna click on this and open it the default way, with the script text file. Okay. So in here, it's very much like Node Package Manager, or what is it, package.json in Node. In Ruby, you have a gem file. In Python, you probably have something similar where you can download external packages, right? This is that for iOS. So pods are kind of like modules in NPM where people have built these things and you can require them into your project, and this will help you download it. Okay. So inside of the pod file, open the pod file in Atom, add the dependencies. Underneath the pods for this project name, you want to add the dependency. Right, so in this case, we're going to add Alamo Fire. So we're going to paste that in here. Pod, Alamo Fire, and then this is the version that we want. That's the latest one. So we're going to save this file. We're going to close it. And once we're done with that, we're going to save and close the pod file and install the pods. And all that is pod install. And it's going to go in there and install all the pods. Right? So it just installed Alamo Fire. It grabbed that dependency from the internet and it put it in my folder here. So now I have a bunch of new files in my folder. So before, I only had this one, and the pod file was generated for us using pod init. Now, this is the pods folder with all the different pods that you have downloaded, right? The different dependencies. It's very much like the Node modules folder. It's all the stuff that's downloaded via CocoaPods is in that folder, right? So now you also have this AF demo, the white kind of Word version of the workspace, and then this is the podfile.lock, which you don't really need to open. So if you want to add new pods, you just open a pod file, put it in there, and then run pod install. Okay. If you want to delete the pod, you open it, delete that, and run pod install. It'll just delete it because there's nothing in there, right? But after you have this white version of the workspace, you're always going to be opening your project using this guy instead of the blue one, right? So over here it says open the white Xcode file. You'll be working on that from now on. So the dependencies are integrated into your project automatically, right? And before, back in the day in December, you had to physically tell it that, yeah, we're gonna use Alamo Fire as a dependency for my project. But now, I was working with it yesterday, and it seems that all you really need to do is do Command B to build it, and everything is just done. I think CocoaPods had something to do with that. They must have integrated it automatically. And how do you know that it's integrated, right? So you want to open up your project file, go to some view controller, And as long as you can type import, if it auto-completes, then it's integrated, right? So this is something I can import. So I can import Alumofire, and I can use those functions now, right? So I've imported Alumofire, and now we're gonna do the exact same thing. We're gonna go to the Star Wars API, and we're gonna grab the JSON file, right? And in Alumofire, as you can see, making a post request, well, this should be get. Making a get request. This is all the code that we need, right? So we're gonna type in Alumofire dot request, and it's going to be this one, data request, with a long string of stuff, right? And we want this long string of stuff because we want to, you want to add some parameters or headers in there if you want, right? So Alumofire will change their documentation, and this is part of the reason it broke my previous projects, is that they'll change the ways that they define this stuff from time to time. So that is something that you need to pay attention to in the documentation. So the recent version of it, there's basically the first argument is going to be the link, the URL, right? And that URL is this one. This is what we're going to use, right? So we're going to do HTTP Star Wars API.co API people / That's my URL. The second argument is whether it's a GET request or a POST request. So in this case, it's a GET request. Parameters, right now we don't have any, so we just make it nil, right? Headers, nil. Parameter encoding, we can just get rid of this argument for now because there are no parameters. You'll see that if we do have parameters, we want to encode them properly so that they can set over in the right format. Right? And those are only, parameters are only possible in a POST request. In a GET request, there are no parameters. It's like there is no rec.body for doing a GET request. Right? So, but for GET requests, you can send a header. In the header, they're going to require you to have some kind of user ID or something. Okay, so headers, no, we're not going to send any headers. But if we wanted to, we can just make a variable here, give it an object, and then put that there in the headers parameter. Okay, so this is the line where we're going to initiate that, and over here we have dot response JSON, JSON, and then we have response in, like that. We'll close it, right? So now, between this block of code, this block here, this is where we're going to put the stuff, right? So inside of here, we're going to perform actions on the data that we get back. And in this case, we're just going to print it out, right? So let. Now, something to note when you're doing these APIs, you never know if you're getting something back or not. Right? Sometimes their APIs will stall, or sometimes it'll give you back something that's unexpected. You want to have, you want to be defensive in your programming to handle those kind of cases because they will happen. You don't want your app to crash if this one request out of 100 gives you a nil. Right? So always be defensive when you're treating these responses. So if let JSON results equals to response.result. And let's see what else. Dot value, right? As and as dictionary. Then we're going to print the JSON result, Okay, that's really all we need. So if we run this guy, we should be expecting to see the same JSON data as the previous project. So this is how you do it using Almofire. And you can see it's a lot cleaner. Almofire also handles a lot of the different queues for you, and we're going to talk about that more tomorrow. The Grand Central Dispatch. That's kind of the lecture for tomorrow. But basically, it's doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes that helps you. Ah, okay. So we got the same error. So every time we do this, we have to go into the plist and do that. So what was it over here? App transport security settings. This guy. It's nope, don't want that. Allow arbitrary loads. Yes. And there we go. Got the JSON data back. Okay. Now, you can also send post requests using the same method, really, but this time you give it a method.post, and you also have some parameters. And this parameters is just the variable that I made on top. And I made it into an object, and I gave it some data, and I just put it there. Right? So parameters is the argument name, but parameters is also a variable that I made on here, just so you know that. And if you do have parameters, you want to encode it with the JSON coding.default. And then with the headers, you give it some headers. It's another variable that I made. And the post request would be sent. Almofire will send it. So I'm not going to demo that because I don't have a backend to really show that. But this is how you would send a post request if you do have a backend that handles that request. Okay. I think that's it for this one. It's just going to